going to introduce our next speaker, and that's Dr. Michael McCullough. He's a principal with ERA Economics. They're the firm that we brought on board to conduct the study. He's also a professor of agribusiness at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. So Michael, if you'll come and share the results of the study.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you all for coming today and listening to this project. I want to thank the sponsors again. I think this turned out to be a really great project, and it's a good good learning experience to understand what's going to happen here in the future and moving forward and implementing SGMA. I also want to thank all of the folks that gave their time to sit down and chat with me and chat with the team about what's going on, how they're adjusting to SGMA on their dairies. I cornered a lot of my students in the hallway and you know, pulled information out of them as well. So we're going to go through what we've estimated to be the impacts of SGMA on dairies in the San Joaquin Valley here. So just to start it off, by 2040 full implementation, this is our base estimates, and we're going to get into what builds up to this in the next couple of minutes, but we're basically looking about $218 million reduction in value in dairy feed. That pushes forward into both milk and beef production, and we'll see about an $833 million reduction in value there. And then what we've done is built into our model to be able to show the forward linkages into dairy and beef processing, which is something that all the models that are out there on SGMA impacts right now don't do. So this is something that I'm pretty proud of that the team put together. And so we're seeing about a $1.12 billion reduction in milk and beef processing, and in total, that's about 7,500 jobs in the industry. This is just on the dairy side. We'll bring in other crops as well and talk about that and talk about things that we didn't look at. So, key results, as Jeff pointed out, the impacts are disproportionately greater in non-district areas. Those areas that don't have access to surface water are going to have bigger reductions. One thing that I think we found from this study, as opposed to the previous reports, is that the value per acre foot of water for you know, water that's going into a dairy through feed and through silage is as equivalent, is as big as other high-valued crops. So I know at least some of the studies that I've done, some of the other things that are out there, we've looked at impacts of SGMA and we said, well, you know, what's the first thing that's going to come out? Silage. That's not necessarily true because there's a lot of value add there. So that's kind of a positive note on this study. SGMA impacts on the beef cattle industry are primarily through higher feed costs, fewer cold cows, fewer calves. And then, as Jeff also mentioned, the Colorado River curtailments are going to have pretty big impacts. We don't know what that's going to look like. We don't know how that's going to go. Everyone's got their own plans up, and so that'll be an interesting thing to see moving forward. So, a little overview. I'm going to give you just a quick snapshot on trends, just to see where we're at, state of the industry. We'll talk about how we modeled SGMA, and then how that leads to those impacts that we just talked about, and then think about what other things need to be considered, what things do we not, were we not able to include, and how we can move forward in this. So, I think this is a good snapshot. Energy prices, fuel prices have been fairly steady, and then in the last couple of years have taken off. And it doesn't look like anything is going to come down, at least not in California anytime soon. So 80% increase in fuel and natural gas prices in the last 2 years, 3 years. At the same time, we've seen pretty big increases in feed costs, right? This is primarily driven through increased import feed prices and then increased hay prices as well. So 33% increase since 2020. If we're thinking about the inventory of cattle in the area, we've had beef cattle increasing since 2015, which is kind of interesting. The slow, steady decline in the dairy cattle inventory. But at the same time, about a 1% increase in productivity per cow since the year 2000. So one of the saviors in this particular industry in thinking about these things, higher costs, is increased productivity. I think in general, just as an aside, everyone looks to California for this kind of thing, right? For really pushing the limit on stuff. And so that's one thing that we can say is pretty neat. One of the things I've been doing over the last 10 years is looking at regulation and impacts of regulation, all types of regulation on California farms. And always the outcome of these studies has been trying to stress to policymakers, to folks, that no regulation happens in a bubble. Things aren't implemented by themselves, right? And in particular on dairies, you've got waste management plan, you've got a nutrition management plan, how you spread your manure, you've got conservation management practice plans, right? How you're going to take care of dust. We've got methane emission reductions that the industry wants to try and get to, is set goals for, and SB 1383. All of this stuff interacts in how it's implemented on the farm, on the dairy. I'm sure you all know this and live this. Some things in particular that we've tried to put into our models in order to show how this comes out is acres for nutrient management, how dust control is taken care of, herd attrition and what that means for greenhouse gas emissions and methane, and then feed availability and costs, right? So these are all the things, how water and increased cost of water, decreased supply of water is going to affect. That's going to relate back to all these other plans, all these other regulatory practices and management. So how did we model SGMA? As Jeff put up, we've got a bunch of different GSAs. The study area for this particular project is San Joaquin Valley, south of San Joaquin County. We've looked at 12 subbasins, 78 GSAs in those subbasins, and we've aggregated them up, both non-district and district areas, into areas that we can look at. With all of these GSAs, we've taken their groundwater sustainability plans, and we've incorporated them and built them into the model. It's no small feat. There's a lot of effort into this, and I think it's come together pretty well. In doing so, we've said, okay, we're going to take all of these plans at face value and assume that everything is going to go, right? And I think in doing this, we're kind of conservative in our total water reductions. And so if we look at these impacts, and we've done this over 5-year increments up into full implementation in 2040, we've got total cuts of 1.5 million acre feet in this study area. Now again, this is taking all of these plans at face value. We'll see, as Jeff and I were talking, was it 2025, when the revisions come in, how this might change. Again, overlaying the map of the districts, and then thinking about where feed's growing, where the dairies are located, we see 22%, almost a quarter of the dairies being located in non-district areas, and then 27% of the hay and silage crop in those areas as well. And so just from the very get-go, we know that these are going to be the areas that are going to be hit the hardest with SGMA. So incorporating all of this into our economic models, we're able to get an estimate of how this is going to play out. How we do this is we look at direct estimates, direct impacts. We're doing this at 3 different levels on crop production. All the studies that you see out there right now are basically just looking at crop production, and then we take that forward and we go into milk and beef production as well. So how does feed enter into the dairy? How does water enter into the dairy? So that's the additional component of this. And then bringing it forward again into processing, something that we haven't seen before at all, and how that pulls through. So if we have a reduction in raw milk supply, what does that mean for processors, right? If we have a reduction in cows that we're going to be able to cull for beef, what does that mean for processors? Those are all of our direct impacts, both forward and backward. And then we also have secondary impacts, right? And so these are the impacts that are going to be felt by folks that supply dairies with inputs. And they're going to be, those are the indirect effects, and then they're also going to be the impacts for workers, right? So if we have 7,500 fewer jobs, that means we have 7,500 people that don't have money from the industry that they're going to spend in their local economy. So these are all of our induced effects. So we want to add all of this stuff together to come up with our total effects, right? With our total impacts at sigma. I want to say one thing in particular. We only focused on dairy and beef in this. So we weren't looking at forward-linked industries and other types of agricultural processing in the valley, right? We didn't look at what's going to happen in the citrus industry or the grape industry. We didn't do any of those types of things. That's more. Part of building this, again, part of building in Sigma is to understand dairy production. So we spent a lot of time chatting with dairy folks, spent a lot of time talking with processors, going over old work and really building this up. And so what we've got is the interaction of Sigma on farm, right? Less water for feed, less water for nutrient management. How do we model this? So being able to put that stuff together. More imported feed, water costs to pay for projects, all of this stuff is built in to those initial costs. And we've got here just a sampling of how things look for a particular dairy and their costs. Again, this varies where you're at, how you run your dairy. So let's jump into our impacts. 2040, we are estimating about a 10% reduction. And overall, it's about a 10% reduction due to Sigma, full implementation. So on our herd size, we can see we've got in total a decrease in the herd of almost 130,000 cattle. That's 10% overall. And then you can note from the maps that this is not equally distributed throughout. It depends on the GSAs. It depends on whether you're a white area, whether you're in a district area, that type of a thing. So there's a lot of particulars in here, but we can see how this is spread through. Same thing for crop acreage. It's kind of neat to see the back and forth between these two maps. If we go back to dairies. Well, that's fine. Anyway, looking at silage acreage reduction as well, it's spread about the same, right? I think one thing to note that came out of this, again, that's different from the things that we've seen prior, is that silage crops who tend to be up top, they're not anymore, right, in the value added. And this is true in all the evidence that I've talked to, all the farmers that are out there, people are typically charting to move towards more annuals, right? This is both because of a reduction in water, it's because of the value added that dairy gives to it, and it also helps manage risk, right? So if you're planting annuals as opposed to perennial tree crops and that type of thing, you're able to change things up depending on whether it's a dry year or a wet year, and banking things. So a little summary, and then we can hand it off. Overall, if we put all of this stuff together, direct effects on herd size, 129,000 head, we can see this moving through from 20, 30, 35, and into 40. Based on most of these projects, these impacts, the majority of these impacts are going to happen later on, right? Things are going to slowly ramp up, and between 2035 and 2040, you can look at the differences and see just in herd size going from 0 to 1% reduction, 2% reduction to the final 10% reduction there. Milk production the same. Milk production goes down about 7%, as does total value in milk, and then beef value down 10%. These are all of our direct effects. When we roll this forward again, we see our total impacts of Sigma. So a couple of things to point out in particular on our bottom right-hand corner, we've got the total for dairy and beef. This is direct effects, feed for dairies, and dairy processing, an overall impact to the industry of $2.2 billion. So $2.2 billion reduction. In total, what we've estimated is a $3.9 billion reduction. Now, again, I want to caveat this, that we're not looking at any forward links, backward links for other crops, right? This is just total crop production and then dairies. Impacts are going to occur gradually. As we said, it's going to ramp up. It's going to get faster and faster, and this is all based on the GSPs that we've included in the models. I think one thing to note that is a fascinating, I think, and a thing to think about, and a real testament to the resiliency of this industry, is that productivity is going to continue to increase, and it's going to be a smaller industry by 10% on our estimates, but it's going to be a more profitable industry for those folks that are still in it. In contrast to some reporting, again, dairy feed is a lot more high value than what folks would previously put out there and say. And then we want to put out this. I know this is a long list and a lot of writing, but there are a lot of other considerations that we couldn't get into in this particular project that are important. Colorado River is a big one. Colorado River cuts is a big one. We've got changes in waste discharge requirements that are going to be coming online, and how that interacts with reduction in water is going to be important to look at. It's going to be important to think about. That implications of that are not going to be the same for everyone. Again, it's going to be different depending on where you're at. We didn't look at any of the changes in efficiencies or trade-offs for dairy processing with an increased capacity due to reduction in raw milk supply. That would be an interesting thing to think about, how that might change or put a little bit more focus on increasing quality and therefore increasing value. And then we didn't get into any of the different economic costs, any of the environmental benefits of any of the land repurposing schemes, or thinking about that, right? That's a big one if we're thinking about conservation management plans, is dust. What's going to happen with all that fallowed land, right? How are we going to use that fallowed land? There's issues if it's just left fallow and left to dirt. There's issues with dust. There's issues with pest pressures. There's issues with existing nutrient management plans as well. Looking at greenhouse gas reductions, how that interacts with all these things, and then finally thinking about those other forward linkages. Those are all important considerations that we didn't get into here. And with that, I think I'll pass it on.